I'm Christian Burris, and I am the co-chair of the ZSR Lecture Series, and I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to today's lecture, which is in observance of Earth Day. And for today's panel, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dee Dee Johnston, the Director of the Office of Sustainability here on campus. So, Dee Dee, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Christian. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is the 4th annual celebration. Z. Smith Reynolds Library was the instigator of birthday celebrations here on campus before there was an Office of Sustainability, so we're very grateful to them for this continued partnership. Since we may have varying levels of understanding of this subject matter here in the room before we get started, I thought it would be useful to make a distinction between the natural gas that has historically been collected as a byproduct of oil drilling and the more recently promoted source known as shale gas. This has become newsworthy as a result of the enormous deposits of shale gas discovered in the Marcellus field, which is up there in your upper right-hand corner. You can see it there in the northeast area of the country. This has become newsworthy. This Marcellus field has extended across large sections of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and New York. It's also affiliated there with the Appalachian Basin, as you can see. Also useful, I think, to note, you might not be able to see it in the legend here on the screen, but the areas are color-coded there from shallowest and youngest to deepest and oldest. And areas of that Marcellus, I'm going to leave the microphone here just for a second to point out on the map. Areas of this Marcellus region dip a toe down into the far corner of North Carolina. Can you all see that? So in terms of what we would have access to, I think we'll talk a little bit about North Carolina today, and you can see that, just that little tip there. And as far as the age of this, as a non-renewable fossil fuel, that gas that's created there in the Marcellus range is 390 million years old. So this is, don't be fooled, this is not a renewable resource. And if you're not familiar with the technology here, this is a look at, sorry for panelists, you can't really see behind you, the way fracking is done. The second well over there to your right goes straight down, and then it comes in at an angle to get very, very deep down in here. This is about 5,300 feet deep, so that's about 300 Empire State Buildings stacked head to head to get down in there. So from a land rights perspective, we see a lot in the news about those landowners who are giving up their rights to their land to get this resource out. But as you can see from the surface there, it goes straight down and it goes down in an angle. So there's a little bit of a dispute there sometimes about whose land that actually is deep under the Earth's surface. This is a list here of some of the pros of natural gas, and there certainly are many of them. It's widely used. It currently contributes to 21% of the world's energy production. Delivery infrastructure for natural gas already exists. We don't need to build many more pipelines. It's used extensively for power generation as well as heat. It's the cleanest of all of the fossil fuels. It emits 45% less carbon dioxide than coal, 30% less carbon dioxide than oil. There is seemingly an abundant domestic supply. It can be used as a automotive fuel in the form of liquefied natural gas. It burns cleaner than gasoline or diesel. It can be used to make plastics, chemicals, fertilizers, and produce hydrogen. The industry is currently employing 1.2 million people in the United States, and as a result of fracking, natural gas has become very, very cheap. It's at $2.50 per 1,000 cubic feet, and that's less than a fifth of the price of natural gas coming from other parts of the world. Cons. As I mentioned, it's a non-renewable resource. It does still emit carbon dioxide when burned. It contains 80 to 95% methane, and if you're not familiar with greenhouse gas compositions, methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. It's explosive and very potentially dangerous, especially when it's being transported. Additional cons associated with fracking to get this natural gas out: contamination of potable groundwater with methane and fracking chemicals. Companies are not required to disclose the composition of those fracking chemicals. There's surface water pollution from dumping salty fracking wastewater into rivers. There's air pollution at and downwind of fracking sites. The greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas is greater than coal over a 1,000-year time frame as a result of the various gases, including methane, that result from the process. There are earthquakes. The U.S. Geological Survey has confirmed that there are earthquakes that are caused by the injection of post-frac wastewater deep underground, and casing leaks. So as that drilling we looked at that goes down into the side, as the casing leaks occur, they can lead to gas in groundwater. So how many of you have actually seen the movie Gasland? So you saw them lighting their water on fire. So that's a result of that, in some cases even lighting creeks on fire. So I guess the overarching rhetorical question for the group here is the trade-off in environmental harm and public health one that we just have to accept. So I'm going to introduce our panelists for today. From your left all the way over to your right, Professor Richard Schneider teaches environmental law at the Wake Forest University School of Law. He's legal chair of the North Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club and is a board member of the Yadkin River Keeper. Welcome. To his left, Dr. Lucas Johnston is assistant professor of religion and environmental studies. His interdisciplinary research and writing focuses primarily on environmental ethics and sustainability-oriented social movements. He's an editor for the Journal of the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, and has served as an environmental consultant for industry groups. And last but not least, Mr. Nathan Atkinson is an attorney with Spillman, Thomas, and Battle here in Winston-Salem. Mr. Atkinson's primary area of practice is litigation, focusing on complex tort litigation, including complex environmental and toxic tort lawsuits involving exposure to various chemicals and contaminants. He has experience litigating complex multi-party lawsuits involving drilling, hydrofracturing, procurement of energy, extraction of natural resources, and environmental contamination. So I'm going to take that out of the rhetorical and place it back in the hands of the panel. So panelists, do we have to just accept this trade-off in environmental harm and public health in the name of cheap and abundant energy?
What would you like to answer?
Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Well, this is clearly a huge issue because, as you can see from the map that Dee Dee showed, this potential areas that can be fracked are quite extensive, and happen to go over some very important, or right next to or along and over very important underground water resources like the Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest, things like that. So the potential environmental impact of fracking is very large. But on the other hand, it's also clear that there are some real pros to extracting natural gas as a potential source of energy. I would say, just to kind of give a short answer to your question, that it's not necessary to accept the trade-offs. If we go slowly, we do it in a transparent fashion, and we have the necessary legislation and regulation in place to be sure that if this gets done, it gets done in the safest way possible. And I guess what concerns me most is kind of the headlong rush into this fracking without much thought. There's a lot of money to be gotten from fracking, even though the price of natural gas has plummeted so much here in the last several months. And the fact that there's a lot of money in it means that there are a lot of people who are interested in pushing this forward without the regulation in place, while there's still a very kind of patchwork approach to it in the states and no coordinated federal approach to it. The faster that they can move in and get something done, the better for them. But I would think that is going to mean that that's probably going to be the worst situation from the standpoint of the environment. So I would just say that we need to be slow about this, study it, and like I said, be transparent about the process and have the regulations and legislation in place, and maybe we can take advantage of this source of energy. There's another whole question about whether the existence of this is simply delaying us from pushing forward on other sources of energy, which really are renewable, like sunlight and wind and that kind of thing. But I'll just put that out there, and we can talk about that later, or if people have questions about it, that's fine. But that would be kind of my short answer. So you can imagine what my long answer.
Yeah, we'll wait for that. A couple of follow-up questions from that. Do either of you gentlemen want to comment on the trade-off?
Sure. My background is representing industry, so I'm the bad guy. And I don't speak for industry, I speak from my experience in working with industry, the natural gas and the oil companies. And I think I do have some insight to share into what industry views as potential trade-offs. And I can tell you, I don't want to trade off. And I don't think industry wants to trade off. It's not good for anyone. I don't think that there has to be a trade-off. The hydraulic fracturing industry has been around for years. It's been proven to be a safe and viable method of extracting energy from our planet. I do think that there are, I do agree with Dr. Schneider that there are some concerns as North Carolina looks to bringing in the potential for shale plays in our state. They need to be looked at very closely. North Carolina DENR is doing that. There are criticisms about North Carolina DENR's approach to the study of shale plays, and maybe it's going to work. And I would echo that there probably are some concerns on some levels about some understudies of particular aspects of how the shale play would apply in North Carolina if it actually comes here. But on a countrywide basis, I would argue that this is a tested, proven method for extracting natural gas. I don't think there has to be a trade-off on health impacts. I don't want there to be a trade-off on health impacts. And I think if we want to dig into some of the various studies and observations that private industry, NGOs, and governmental organizations have made, I think we can do it. I mean, and I know we can do it. I don't know how many folks have looked at the North Carolina DENR's study on bringing fracturing, but it gives a pretty good roadmap of the concerns and what we're doing to address those concerns. So I would suggest that if you are interested in how it's going to play out in North Carolina, take a look at that and raise your own issues with what our state regulatory agencies have done to protect the citizens. I think they're on the right track. I could bid against myself and say that there are some things that we need to do more of, but I do think that the industry as a whole is a proven technology that can safely provide these types of energy alternatives and alternative shale plays without giving up the health concerns that I think everyone has.
So in this next short session, the North Carolina Assembly is looking at two really important energy-related issues. They're looking at rolling back the requirement that utility providers generate at least 12.5% of their electricity or energy from renewables, and setting that at a low bar of only 3%. And secondarily, they're looking at legalizing fracking for the state in just 2 years. So what does that mean for us as citizens, and what should we or could we expect from our elected officials? Because Mr. Schneider referenced going slowly, and 2 years in this realm is anything but slow.
Yeah, I would just mention that 2 years is anything but slow, and the problem is that I meant to bring in, but I didn't bring in because I forgot. But if you go to the Energy Information Agency website, which has a lot of information about all different sources of energy, you can find there a really striking map of the shale play in the Barnett Shale near the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I think it starts about 20 years ago, and it goes over the course of about 1 minute, and it goes year by year through that 1 minute, and it shows you the number of wells that have been drilled around the Dallas-Fort Worth area to frack. And as you move from 1990 kind of forward, you get just, 1 or 2 very sporadic wells, nothing out of control, and then as you get a little bit, basically the rate doesn't increase too much until you get to the early 2000s, and then it picks up a little bit, And then in 2005, suddenly the entire area is black with well drilling. What's the reason for that? Well, I would say it's two things. One is that the technology for fracking has been getting better and better. So even though it has existed for a while, the technology is better, and so that's increased the economics of it, the economic efficiency of it. But secondly, fracking, because of the energy bill of 2005, was exempted from the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so that frackers did not have to take into account, with respect to at least federal law, what they were putting into the water that was eventually getting into the drinking water. At 2005, that's when the bloom happens, and I think that's not, that's not a coincidence. It's something that, industry does not want to be regulated. And, I think that it's great to say that these things are going to go forward with concern for health and that kind of thing, but if I could just take a minute here and just mention to you what's in the most recent bill that's been reported out of the Senate Energy Committee in North Carolina. This is just for our state, where, as you can see, we don't even have that much that seems to be eligible for fracking. But the bill that was reported out a couple days ago from the Energy Committee does the following thing. It intentionally removes local government control in the fracking process by invalidating existing local ordinances and specifically prohibiting new ones. Deliberate lack of transparency by limiting public record requests on industry activities. Easing restrictions to explicitly allow for groundwater contamination up to a certain level. Restricting DENR from enforcing any environmental rule or safeguard that would prohibit fracking. Delegating authority to regulate oil and gas industry to a new bureaucracy, the Oil and Gas Board, consisting of political appointments largely from the oil and gas industry. Stripping environmental rulemaking authority from the Environmental Management Commission. And last but not least, going even further than a lot of other states have gone, forcing unwilling landowners to have gas drilled from under their property if adjacent landowners agree to frack. That is an extremely aggressive bill. And it doesn't call for study. It doesn't call for anything deliberate or slow. It doesn't call for any kind of a transparent process. And if that's what we're looking at in our legislature, I'm afraid.
So if I were a conspiracy theorist, I would ask Mr. Atkinson to return to his comment that industry doesn't see a trade-off. If I were that conspiracy theorist, I would say that some of these government bodies are responding to lobbying from industry. So if industry doesn't see a trade-off, why would they push for a lack of transparency?
Well, you're assuming that, first of all, I don't know who proposed that bill, and I haven't seen it, I wish I had.
It was Bob Rucho,
Okay.
Republican from Mecklenburg.
Well, the concept that there's a lack of transparency is just not true. There is transparency in the industry. And if we want to dig into what areas you want to talk about, we can. The chemicals are disclosed. They always have been disclosed, just for the last several years. In terms of OSHA requirements, they've always been labeled in MSDS sheets that are available on the work sites. The chemicals that are used, to the extent that there are even chemicals that are being used, are also disclosed under various state regulations: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, New York. Well, New York's a little bit different beast, but those all have their own disclosure requirements. So, there's a lot of talk about proprietary information. Why is there this lack of transparency? There's not. You want to know what's going into the wells, you just go and look on the internet, and you can pull it up quite easily. And if you can't find it, I'll help you find it. And it'll show you what Mr. Fox refers to up to as 596 chemicals per fracking well, which is a gross exaggeration of what's actually being used in wells. There is a transparency. There is regulation. There's federal regulation. There's state regulation. There's local regulation. There's always been regulation. I think 12 or so different federal regulations that do actually govern the oil and gas and the drilling industry from start to finish. The state regulations, frankly, is where I want my regulations to come. I don't want someone from the federal government who doesn't know anything about the geological formations in North Carolina to try and regulate how things are done down in North Carolina. There are a lot of misconceptions about the way these wells are drilled. You can go from different places in West Virginia, northern West Virginia, where Mr. Fox's description of 1 to 3 million gallons of water per well is accurate. And you drive down the road about 100 miles, and it's almost a pure nitrogen frac, which is an inert gas mixed with very few chemicals. So, look, I'm not saying you don't have to be careful, but let's not say that it's not regulated, because it is. Let's not say that there aren't studies going on about the appropriateness and safety of North Carolina's water supplies and health of the citizens, because there are. I don't necessarily disagree that 2 years is pretty fast. But let's not suggest that they just started in 2010 on a blank slate and are trying to create, or 2012, and are now trying to create a new roadmap for fracking. They're not. This is a system that's been going on. Fracking's been conducted in vertical wells since 1946, 48. Horizontal fracturing has been taking place in the United States since, or horizontal wells for the last 30 years. It's just only recently that some smart guy in Kansas decided to combine hydraulic fracturing with horizontal wells, and now there's a brand new technology. So yeah, the technology's moving quick. You have to stay up with it, and you can't rush. Now, to here's I don't think you have a problem. And I don't think anyone in the industry probably has a problem with North Carolina taking a little bit more time to figure this out. Look, these wells aren't going to be popping up down here in the next 2 years anyway. So let's figure out how to do it right. Now's the time. We've got all of these studies that are coming out. Pennsylvania and West Virginia didn't have the benefit of where North Carolina is right. Let's take the time to do it right. And I think North Carolina has the potential and hopefully the interest to do that. So I think industry wants to have it done right in North Carolina, and I just disagree with the concept that there is not transparency or regulation under it. And it clearly is.
Isn't there a difference, though, between transparency when it comes to the proprietary chemicals that are being inserted into the wells and, say, the waiver of certain local environmental regulations or state environmental regulations, and even the doing away with, as this most recent bill discusses, the public comment period on any legislation, which is an important, seems to me, input if you're talking about transparent legislation.
Yeah, let's all.
Would you please speak into the microphone?
Apologies. Sure.
Yeah, but let's all agree transparency is good. I don't know who proposed a bill where there's no public comment on fracking. I don't agree with it. So you're not going to get me to agree with the concept that the public doesn't have the right to comment on its own protection and health. So.
Okay, well, yeah, it's a Halliburton exception, and it's written into law that there was no public disclosure period for this particular form of extraction.
You're referring to the Halliburton loophole, which isn't really a loophole, since fracking was actually.
It was your opinion that there is not a lack of public disclosure period in the law, when in fact there has been written into it, and the 2005 Energy Act was what in this area was overturned.
Sorry, yeah, no, my comment was I don't like it. I think there needs to be that type of period for public opinion. I did disagree that there is no regulatory oversight on the federal level in the national or on the natural gas and oil industry. I also don't think that there is any lack of oversight on the industry in general, and I think that the preferable location for that type of oversight is in the states.
So let's pause on this state versus federal issue for just a second. So the EPA, through the EPA, we have Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. I mean, this is not the first time that water's been on fire in the history of this country. So some states like New York and Texas have really great laws in place, standards for these practices, and other states don't. So how are we to believe that leaving it up to the states is a better road to follow than setting national standards when the atmosphere isn't restricted to any one state, and one really miserable accident can cloud things over for everybody?
Yeah, and I can't comment scale of which states are doing better than others. All I can say is that North Carolina has the benefit of looking at those states and creating their system from scratch. We're not in a situation like Pennsylvania where they were looking at hundreds and hundreds and thousands of wells that were even being drilled before they even started grasping the concept of the need for this regulatory oversight. We are at an infant stage in North Carolina, and I think there's a great opportunity to learn from those states that you mentioned that are doing things well and capitalize on that. On a more micro level, what I was suggesting is that I don't want the federal government putting the same types of restrictions on us that it does out in Texas, because they could either be too onerous or they could be too mild. What works in Texas just doesn't work in North Carolina geology.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, I think that's an interesting point that you raise, Nathan. It's certainly a debate in environmental law as to whether you regulate something at the federal or the state level. What concerns me with that is, it's funny that most of the time industry prefers one standard. Like if you look at the car industry, the car industry lobbied and spent millions and millions of dollars to keep their being to prohibit kind of the possibility that there would be individual state standards regarding automobiles. They wanted one federal standard so that they could make the same kind of automobile and sell it everywhere. There's an exception with respect to California. If anybody's really interested in that, we can talk about that later. But basically, car makers have two standards: the California standard and the federal standard. So it's interesting to me in any given situation when industry suddenly doesn't want the same standard everywhere. And I think, well, why would they be willing to risk differing state regulations? So what goes through my mind is something that has already happened in a number of industries, but I'll just raise one which is important for North Carolina, which is the hog industry. It's clear that the hog industry, and I'm talking about concentrated animal feeding operations regarding raising pigs, that when the industry started to get regulated in certain states, for instance Iowa and Illinois, they went to other states, namely North Carolina, where we had very little regulation, and they brought their feeding operations in here. And they set up real quickly, and nobody did any studies, and nobody thought about it. And they said they were bringing a lot of jobs, and they in fact brought very few jobs. And they created an environmental disaster in eastern North Carolina. And it's because our regulation was significantly different from the regulation that existed elsewhere. So what I'm concerned about is that here, I don't see that the geology, geology's geology, and I'm not sure that sinking a fracking well is going to be very different in Texas than it is in North Carolina. And so I guess what I would argue that we need federal standards in order to protect all of the states at the same time. And if states want to be more strict, they can be, which is, they've already got that right under most federal legislation anyway, if they want to be more strict. But at least federal regulation would set a floor that industry can't go below. That would make me feel a little bit better than just having every state do it on its own. And again, when I go back to this bill that was reported out of the Energy Committee, I want to tear my hair out. That's a bill that's so pro-industry, it's really unbelievable. So I would say that it's an interesting point, state or federal, but for me, I would feel more comfortable with the federal legislation.
Yeah, and just to briefly comment, I just couldn't disagree more that geology is geology. Geology is not geology. We're talking about vastly different operations in North Carolina than you would Pennsylvania or West Virginia. And I think we kind of agree, Dick. You don't want regulations that relate to wells that are drilled at 8,000 to 10,000 feet in a different state to apply to us. We're talking about the possibility of being 3,000 feet, much closer to the water table, with a vastly different fracturing process, then they entertain and understand. What would work in their states could expose us to extreme water contamination. You've got 8,000 feet between a fracking job and a 2,000 feet. That's why I disagree that geology is geology. I will acknowledge an absolute ignorance on the geology of North Carolina, because I think that's one of the weaknesses in what Diener has produced so far, is a lack of understanding of what is going to need to be done to frack a well in North Carolina. I also don't know how much water, I don't know how much pressure. A well is not a well is not a well, it's just not. So I think we actually probably agree that we don't want a federal system that's too lax to come in and regulate North Carolina when there are distinctly different requirements to maintain the public water supply in this state or Pennsylvania or Texas or wherever.
But though there are differences in geology, certainly, couldn't the federal standards have to do with things like exposure of the citizenry to particular hazards or toxins? I mean, these are things you probably would not disagree with either, but these are some of the environmental regulations that are being waived or streamlined so that these wells could be opened up and quickly.
Sure. And it's easy, that's right. I mean, at a very global level, it's very easy to say we don't want the public to be contaminated. But when you really dig down into it, we're talking about different types of pits that are being maintained. If there's even a pit that's being maintained, maybe it's a storage tank. Maybe there are other local requirements that relate to the greater goal of what you've identified that I don't think are going to be protected by just addressing it by federal. If the answer is to lay out a blanket, here's what we're going to do in the states, you pinpoint and identify what's more relevant to your area, which is kind of what I think Dick's saying, making it more stringent. Okay, that's fine, but let's not at least pretend that a federal system alone is going to identify all of the geological and well structure issues that are going to be existing here in the state.
Could I just add one more thing? Sure. I mean, I think that's a good point. But I would just say that, the federal system is already, we've got a lot of years of experience now under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And even though those are federal standards, they're administered largely by the states. EPA has deferred to state, delegated a huge amount of authority to the states. So that the state basically runs those federal programs on its own. And there's a lot of, latitude to be sensitive to local conditions in the Clean Air Act and in the Clean Water Act and in other federal acts. So it's just what the federal requirements would do would be to force states to at least adopt standards that are going to be more or less consistent with standards of the states around them and kind of bring everybody up to a level playing field more or less quickly without I think, losing local flexibility to adapt to local standards. I think that's possible.
I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Yes, Rita.
Related to, actually I have two questions, but I'll answer them now. Related to the issue around Fort Worth, and that you said that if you watch this map, that you can see how many wells have been drilled, and suddenly there was a spike in 2005. Was that related to the fact that they had changed the Safe Drinking Water Act so that they could use different compounds and different chemicals in those wells, or was it just, was it economics? Do you know what it is that sort of accounts for that 2005 spike where suddenly you got so many more wells? Because obviously they weren't changing the technology, I'm assuming. They weren't waiting for a hydraulic fracturing, they were already fracking since 1990, isn't that correct?
Yes, they had they had not done a lot of the horizontal fracking that early, but yes, they had started back in the early 90s.
So were they hydraulic fracking? Was that part of the reason, or was it because of the change in the Safe Drinking Water?
I think it was a combination. I think it was a combination of the technology. I can't see you when I bend down.
I know, I can't either.
I think it's a combination of the two. And nobody. To me, the coincidence is just too striking to say that suddenly in 2005 there was this explosion of drilling. To say that couldn't have been somehow related to the exemption under the Safe Drinking Water Act. If somebody could show me another reason, I'd be happy to listen, and maybe there's a better reason. But I think it's a combination of the better technology and the fracking, and the exemption of the safe drinking water act.
There's also a coincidence of traditionally big oil companies moving into this arena as exploration opens up.
So I do know that sometime near 2005, not an area I study in any detail, it's just a general knowledge, but I also pay for my gas heat. Around 2005, possibly 2004, there was a great spike up in natural gas prices. That, as a retired economist, I know that would surely provide an incentive for much more drilling. It was extreme, but let me turn into a question, because right now, natural gas prices are about as low as I've seen them since I've had natural gas at home. They're $2 per however they measure the quantity. If you watch CNBC every day, it's incredibly low. Why in the world, when there's so little economic incentive to drill for more gas right now, because obviously there's some kind of glut situation, plenty of supply, very low prices, should there be any pressure to lower the standards to encourage natural gas drilling? It seems to me that a legislature just wants to do what it can, maybe put its finger in the eyes of environmentalists, because they got into power 2 years ago.
While everyone's thinking, I'll add my 2 cents to that. A lot of manufacturing is returning to this country based on those low inputs. And so companies that manufacture based on natural gas, that's something that's very attractive to a legislator. And so that's some of what's going on right now in terms of government, but I'll turn it back to the panelists.
I think that's a great argument to go slowly. I mean, I agree. And a lot of the uses for natural gas, for instance, the thing that what Dee Dee mentioned at the beginning, the idea that we could use natural gas to power our cars, I mean, that's just not around the corner. I mean, it could happen, but it's going to cost a lot of money to convert the car industry over to natural gas. And you would think that, while we wait to do that, there could be a lot more study of this issue. So I think the rush it's kind of like the gold rush. I mean, nobody thinks about what the price of gold is going to be. You just want to drill your own, or mine your own claim, and what happens happens. I think that's probably a lot what's going on here. It's not overly price sensitive yet.
Well,
I don't know if you have another.
my observation is just that as technology improves, the $2 per trillion cubic feet becomes less important than it is to how much it costs to get that $2. I mean, the technology through the last 10 years is through the roof. So, you're not getting as much bang for the buck, but it's costing a lot less to get
I'm wondering about the amount of water that's used to do this fracking process. If I understand it right, you push water that's enhanced with these chemicals down way deep that forces the gas up, right? So what happens to that water? And if you're using water in part of the Midwest that has so little of it, isn't that equally as threatening to human consumption and the environment to have less water in such huge amounts?
Yeah, and again, it varies from well to well and from region to region. And I can point you to wells in southern West Virginia where they use a barrel in oil and gas is 44 gallons. So they use 1,000 barrels of water for one well versus millions of barrels in some other wells. So it really is as widely varying as the geology and area that you're in. So we can use no water, next to no water. You've got to have something to mix the proppant with. The traditional form would look at 3 to 5 million gallons of water mixed with some sand or proppant with a little bit of chemicals that are in there to act as biocides and different agents to do different things in the well. 3 to 5 million versus 1,000. It's just so difficult to generalize how much water it's going to take. And that's one of my concerns. I haven't seen anything with any geological certainty that says, is this going to be one of those wells that takes 1,000 barrels, or is it going to be one that takes 3 million to million gallons. That's a concern. My biggest concern in North Carolina is disposal of the water after you're done. I don't know what to do. In North Carolina Dean's report, they don't know what to do. They raise it as an issue, but we've got to figure that out, and that's something the industry has to figure out. What in my view, and I don't know where your economic leanings are, but you set out a structure, you set out a regime that regulates, and you let industry come in and figure out whether or not they can do it economically. I don't know if industry can come down to North Carolina and do this economically. This all may just be a very academic conversation. No one's come down here and proven that you can get gas out and make any money. They're speculating, and they're buying up some leases in about 8 to 10 counties in the state, and they may be able to do it. They may not. We may come back in 3 years and just laugh about how we had this conference and discuss the potential of North Carolina to be a shale play, and it just never happened.
So to add to that, unfortunately, all forms of production from fossil-based fuels are very water intensive. And unbelievably, this one is not at the top, though it does use a lot of water, and that's inexcusable. And there are states that will not allow that post-frac water to be redeposited in that state. So then it's trucked out to another state, which is layers and layers of fossil fuel. But unfortunately, many forms of energy, including lots of agricultural-based energies, would use more water than this process does.
And
It's a problem.
Particularly in water scarce areas, this is one of the costs, for example, of hydraulic fracturing is simply not factored in.
In those areas where it uses a lot of water, and in those areas where it doesn't, that's not an issue.
Yeah, you've really asked two, you also asked what happens to the water, and Dee mentioned some of it gets trucked out, but in Pennsylvania at least, where a lot of this drilling has gone on, and where I think most of the gas lands it starts in Pennsylvania, right, and then it goes around the country. I haven't seen it for a little while, but there, two things happen to the wastewater. One is it's injected into deep level rock formations, and or two, it's simply discharged into the sewer system and goes to the publicly to the public treatment works. And neither one of those has been regulated. There's no regulation right now on what the standards are for injection, what kind of effect that's going to have on groundwater, what kind of effect that's going to have on people in rock formations. In fact, some people have even raised the possibility that there could be a real conflict of interest between, I don't know if you heard of carbon capture. This is what goes on now that people are talking about with respect to coal-fired power plants and other big generators of CO2. They capture the CO2 and then they bury the CO2. Well, some scientists have started to identify a potential conflict between burying CO2 as part of carbon capture and injecting this wastewater at deep levels. There might be an issue there in terms of the ability to make sure that the CO2 is actually stays where it's buried. And then the second thing, that the discharges to the wastewater treatment facilities has really overwhelmed several of the wastewater treatment plants in Pennsylvania. It's a terrible problem, and they're treating it for stuff that they don't really have grasped what's in it. So again, I think, I'm not going to the extent yet of saying for myself here that I oppose all fracking. I might think that personally, but I'm not saying that here. But what I would say is that, again, that kind of thing needs to be thought about, and it needs to be regulated before companies go crazy with their water use or their water release.
A lot of short-term risks for some short-term profit. Yes, in the back.
It's my understanding that a lot of states have addressed the wastewater that's produced from fracking. In states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia, some of them are no longer allowing fracking wastewater to go to the public treatment centers because those centers cannot actually treat that wastewater. But instead, the industry is creating its own ways of treating the wastewater. And I thought that, something like 70% of some of the wastewater that's produced in some of the Marcellus Shale region is already being recycled on site or close to the
And
site
reuse
by
in
the
the
industry.
fracking, yeah.
And reuse in the
Yeah, it's
fracking
actually-
process.
It's even higher than that.
Or that it's being recycled and being turned into something that can be used for other things, such as agricultural purposes. And, some of the largest industry participants have said that in the next 5 to 10 years, they expect to recycle 100% of the water. So that's really something that, that the industry has taken a hold of, which relates to what Nathan said. Y'all can comment on the technology that's improving with wastewater.
Yeah, and I think 65% is really low. There's some projections that they're going to be close to 98, 99% of recyclability of the water within the next couple of years.
So I would sort of turn that question back around, because from what we read and from what you just said, much of the appropriate technology is already in place in many places. So why wouldn't we have overarching regulations or standards for doing this, setting, sort of a lowest common denominator that puts all of these beneficial processes into place? Why would we just leave it up to whatever you want to do in your local areas, whatever you should do?
Well, I'm all in favor of, I think those industries are naturally going to rise to the top. My concern in North Carolina does address some of the smaller players that don't do as good a job as some of the national players. I think that is a concern for a state like North Carolina, where you have an untested shale play. You have national players that are overextended in the Barnett and the Marcellus and the Utica shales, not having machinery to come down. There is a concern that the lowest common denominator may rise to North Carolina in terms of industry technology and the sophistication of which they apply. So, yeah, there is a compelling argument as to why you would jump to that type of a regulation to prevent those type of players to come in a market that may not otherwise govern it. So I can't disagree with that. It's North Carolinian, that is a concern that I have.
Down here?
One of the concerning things that we saw in Gasland yesterday is that the federal government has leased natural gas rights on public lands and national parks. If natural gas or fracking does happen in North Carolina, do the panelists foresee that occurring, if you guys can speculate?
What does that have to do with the national parks, though?
In our state and national, in our public lands.
Well, this goes on right now with all oil drilling. There's lease auctions all the time on BLM federal lands in the West, particularly. In the East, we don't have a lot of federal land. Most of the land that's held in the East is owned privately. But yeah, in the West, there's constant lease auctions happening, and some of them have been around very sensitive areas. And the same process would happen here. If a company wanted to go in and start fracking in a particular area because they think natural gas is there, they would try to convince the BLM to lease that and put that up for a lease. So that absolutely could happen on federal land, and probably would.
I think that raises some significant ethical questions as well, whether or not exploitation of resources on public lands reflects the will of constituencies that live nearby. I think that's a serious question.
So piggybacking on that, there are a lot of these drilling areas, the land is owned by people who are less economically privileged than in other areas. And so if any of you on the panel could comment on the social equity issues at play here, are those people who can least afford to fight back those people who are most affected by a lack of some of these beneficial processes being put into place?
Well, I'll start. Again, just a little anecdote. Speaking of social equities, I don't know if anybody recently in the Wall Street Journal, the home builder D.R. Horton, what they've been doing in North Carolina. Basically, they've been selling people their homes, and they've been stripping the homes of mineral rights. and then they take the mineral rights and they sell the mineral rights to their energy subsidiary, and which means that their energy subsidiary has all the rights at some future time to have drilling take place under these people's houses. So this has gone on without the people, sometimes without their knowledge, sometimes without them really understanding what it means, and certainly without adequate compensation. And now the North Carolina Real Estate Commission has basically told the home builder that they've got to go in and reinstate those rights with the homeowners. So that's a good thing that's happened, but it certainly is a situation where people without a lot of bargaining power and without a lot of knowledge were, giving up something that they really didn't understand and didn't realize, the effect that it could have on them in the future. So that kind of predatory thing, I don't want to say that kind of thing is going to happen all the time in industry, but again, it's a concern, and this is a difficult thing for people who, when you lease a fracking well on your property, as you saw from Gasland, you get a certain amount of money, and if you desperately need that money, it's awfully hard to say no, even if you take into account what the effect might be on your water or on your neighbor's water. That's a real issue. And I think it's important to identify it. I'm not sure I have an answer to it, but it's definitely important to identify.
Yeah, and I can't say social inequity doesn't come into play. It does. You're not drilling on Park Avenue in Manhattan for natural gases. And you look to West Virginia or Pennsylvania, and a mountain region where these types of resources exist. Is that to say that they're being targeted? No. Is that to say that there's not a collateral fallout on those people's? Yeah, there could be if it's not done properly and safely. And I just think it's a little bit of a stretch to suggest. And I'm not saying anyone is suggesting intentional inequities, but yeah, there are probably some social inequities when the types of resources are located in a population that doesn't have the types of economic resources as some other. I think it's fair.
Other questions from the audience? Do you want to ask your second question, please? Yes, in the front row.
I know watching Gasland that they showed the pools of processed water and I wonder, is that part of the recycling program that was mentioned? And if so, how safe are those really when, the lime clay, which it protects it, but, as soon as the clay cracks, just like with the landfill, it all seeps back in. And I just wonder what is the process of recycling fracking water, and does it still require that it sit out and evaporate and turn into VOCs and ozone?
Yeah, and that's a product of the surface geology, is what types of surface bits you're going to have, and what types of reclamation systems are going to be required. That is regulated by the state. Again, I think it's a great example of why I don't want someone in Pennsylvania telling us what is good for North Carolina geology. There are pits. The example that he gave was one of an evaporation system. There are also systems that are much more advanced, including storage tanks and the recycling those wastewater that are now becoming more and more available. So it's not always just clay. There are some clay pits. There are, and then also depends on what it is that's coming out of the water that you're using clay pits, but usually you're looking at some type of a lining or a storage tank. And as the recycling abilities increase, I think you're going to see more and more of that type of a resource available, because it saves money to be able to reuse that water. So having it just sitting out there evaporating, if you can reuse it in a situation where there is increased water use on a well, that's obviously going to be the objective of the industry, to try and figure out a way to spend less money on water and reuse what's already being used.
But do you know some more of the details of the process of recycling that water and how it's done?
Chemically, I don't know much more about the recycling, other than just a blanket statement that it is improving, that the percentages have increased, and certainly we could try to figure that out together.
What you raised, though, is a good point with respect to the air pollution. So we've talked a lot about water, but we haven't talked a lot about air. You're talking about releasing VOCs and things like that, and methane. And here's a point where the Clean Air Act, needs to come into play. And the Obama administration, realizes that, and in fact, recently the EPA issued standards with respect to methane capture at these wells. But, again, the disappointing thing, they were lobbied very heavily to have these standards be phased in, and so this is called green completion. And they're not going to come into effect until 2015. What's unfortunate is that apparently already 50% of the producers out there have already got these standards, which means the technology is not only available, it's actually economic to use, and yet it wasn't imposed until 2015 because of heavy lobbying efforts undertaken by industry to be sure that, arguing that they wouldn't be able to do it. Again, it's hard for me to imagine that they couldn't do it more quickly than that, given the fact that 50% apparently already do to it. But the Clean Air Act has got to come into play here with respect to that kind of emission. Whether it's from the pits or whether it's from as a byproduct of the actual drilling of the well. That's where a lot of the methane can get out. And we have to consider too, I think, and maybe I will raise this now, is this just, continuing, is this just kind of an unfortunate prolongation of our dependency on hydrocarbons? And because even though it is a lot cleaner than coal or oil, it still produces greenhouse gases. And it's still, from that standpoint, if our main concern is climate change, why are we willing to spend all this money and rushing into this? Isn't this just the easy way out? Shouldn't we really be addressing other renewable sources of energy with a much more focused and funded approach than we are?
I think it gets back to this gentleman's question about the economics of it. So if there seems to be so little profit, the profit margin, even if the cost is, as Nathan says, is very, very low, profit margin can't be that great. And at what point does this bridge fuel excuse prohibit us from moving into investing in renewables? I think it's a fair question, and it's a question we can put back to industry if we have them in the room.
And in that sense, it is a trade-off, which is the question we began with. You are trading off prolonged dependence on fossil fuels of some kind and taking potential research and development monies away from possible renewable fuels. And that is a trade-off. And while natural gas certainly burns cleaner than oil or coal, the additional costs and environmental impacts of exploration and extraction, I think, are still up in the air.
Yeah, because what's the other thing hanging out there, of course, that environmentalists are also very afraid of is nuclear. That's the other kind of shortcut to increasing energy. If you cut back on oil or whatever, and nuclear energy, it's also got its own problems, which are a long way from being solved. So it's a tough issue.
Follow-up question from the lady just in front of you. Thanks.
Can you specify further, because we're suggesting that sustainable sources of energy simply are not being explored, not going to be advanced. Is there anybody anywhere collecting information, making plans? What are environmentalists doing? Can industry be lured into?
Well, I'll just say one thing that to me would mean an immediate. Everybody talks about the market, but in fact, we don't have a real honest market out there. And the petroleum industry receives huge, huge subsidies from the American taxpayer, including subsidies that go to our military to protect our oil interests outside of the country. So if you take away those subsidies, you're going to find that solar and wind and a lot of other things are going to be a lot more economically interesting. As long as those subsidies are in place, it's going to be a distorted market, and it's going to be very hard to dislodge fossil fuels.
Who's working on that problem?
Nobody. No. Nobody's working on it. Nobody's working on it because you cannot get rid of a subsidy like that without calling it a tax. And as you know, many people have signed pledges against raising taxes. And so that legislation is dead.
It doesn't seem to me that that's going to help us. We need somewhere for, I suppose it's going to be the environmentalists, to regroup, replan, see this as a possible opportunity.
Well, I think it's going to be industry. I think industry is going to go where the money is. And I can't dispute Dick's claims and observations about the taxes. That's a driving force as to how industry makes money. But, you know,
Can the industry be ethical?
Can the industry be ethical?
That's another panel for another day. Let's do it.
You know, the conversation has quickly turned from regulatory to economics, and you know, it seems pretty like that from this side of the table. That's where it gets to be really easy. You know, the industry chases the money, and if the money is there in wind and solar, I think it's going to naturally go there. We talk about you know, why do we go to get $2 natural gas? Well, there's a bunch of it, and it's not cheap to get. So it's a little bit of a mistake to say it's cheap to get. It's getting cheaper. It's getting easier because we're getting better at it. But there's a lot of it that's sitting underneath us right now. So the response is, you know, why not use what we have right now? And if you want to call it a bridge fuel or whatever you want to call it, you know, until industry is or whomever catches up in other areas, why not grab what's available to us right now?
But you see, we're constantly saying we can't do anything but what we're doing now.
Right, and it's the old saying that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, right? There was some sort of forethought, and I think that the point that Dick makes about the subsidies to oil and gas industries is very true. And if we remove those subsidies and let the market handle it, it would work quite differently. But unfortunately, there's almost no perceptible difference between the Energy Policy Act passed in 2005 and Obama's current energy policy, and there's no change in the foreseeable future. So yeah, so for the meantime, we continue riding the fossil fuel horse without thinking ahead a little bit.
What Dr. Johnson's saying is don't hate the player. Don't hate the player. We're playing the hand that's dealt to us.
Well, I'm going to choose the hand.
I mean, there are just billions and billions and billions of dollars out there behind the fossil fuel industry. I mean, and it's spent for specific legislation, and they get what they want.
So theoretically, we live in a democracy. So what do we do as citizens to get to this point?
Well, the Energy Policy Act that was passed in 2005 was actually designed primarily by industry executives. There was a very brief comment period opened up to environmental lobbies and people like that. Very brief, a matter of a couple of days to comment on the Environmental Policy Act, and it was engineered by industry and spearheaded by then Vice President Dick Cheney, who has obviously very close ties to Halliburton and other oil and gas producing industries. So.
Yeah, that's actually not true. Actually, it was passed by like 74 out of 100 senators, which was a lot of Democratic backing. Some of the most influential people on the energy commissions were involved. I think somewhere close to 75% of the House passed it, including a young Democrat by the name of Barack Obama.
I'm not denying that the House and Senate voted on it. I was suggesting that the bill that was put in front of them did not necessarily reflect the desires of the constituency, which I think is what this young lady was referring to, that the current Energy Policy Act does not necessarily reflect the wishes, the priorities, the values of most Americans, but rather reflects the values of a particular industry segment.
Sorry, I was commenting on the fact that you said it was pushed through by Dick Cheney. So.
I said that he spearheaded the creation of that policy.
And that gets back to the transparency. Again, because there wasn't enough public participation, there wasn't enough participation from environmentalists. It's a process that needs, where money speaks too loudly, and there's not enough attention that's given to interests that may not have the monetary backing, but may in fact have more of the public benefit, in mind.
Any final questions before we wrap up?
Yes, I'll ask my second question now. Okay, Marcellus, which is, I watched Gasland last night, so it's not really familiar to me, but when did the actual drilling start in Pennsylvania? 2009? Because that's the start, what happened at the start of the movie. Was that about right when it started?
No, way before that.
Way before that. So all of the consequences of it that were sort of being documented during that film were from previous to his own experience.
I think the film is a reflection of the new proliferation of fracking technology, whereas the drilling's been going on for a very long time. But the combination that Nathan referred to of two different technologies coming together to make the gas come out faster, to make it simple, is more recent.
So, but it seems to me like fracking is something that you just sort of exploded all of a sudden within the last
Pun
handful of
intended,
years,
yes.
right? And so is it because of the change in technology that sort of made this suddenly now open to a lot more fields that it was available to?
Yes, yeah, it's made non-conventional shale plays more accessible where they previously were not.
And a play, we should have said that in the beginning, is an exploration area. It's a potential exploration area, term of art in the industry.
Doesn't anyone want to talk about
Last question.
about faucets lighting on fire or anything, the crazy things that are associated with hydraulic fracturing? Are there any tough questions about that?
Does that really happen?
No, it doesn't. I'm glad you know. No, of course it does. What you saw in the film were faucets actually being lit on fire. But what has been proven time and time again is that those natural gas deposits that were being demonstrated in both Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, and out in Colorado and Texas, is that the ones that were portrayed by Josh Fox were actually biogenic, naturally occurring methane pockets that had absolutely nothing to do with, verified by various state agents, nothing to do with hydraulic fracturing.
This is an important distinction between biogenic and thermogenic methane, right? Which is the distinction. So one kind, thermogenic, is created by the fracking process, or can be. Biogenic is naturally occurring. And so what they found supposedly is that the thermogenic methane is not extant in these particular wells that were mentioned by Fox. I think there is an outstanding question, however, even if I think it's important to look at the fracking process sort of more holistically. So even if the actual hydraulic fracturing does not create thermogenic methane, is it possible that it releases some biogenic methane which can contaminate water, right? I think that is an open question.
Well, it's open to the extent that it's currently being studied. It's not open in that no one has ever established that to be the case.
And so, I mean, as is true with any area of the law, if a person suffers from some wrongdoing, it's up to the person to defend himself. And so I think science always has somebody paying for it, right?
Sure, yeah. If your question is, can you go in and say, someone fracked down the road for me and give me a bunch of money? No, the law doesn't. You've got to be able to approve.
Yeah, and in wrap up, I'd like to invite the panelists to close with any comments, questions that weren't asked to you that you would like to conclude with today. Closing comments? You want to talk about the faucets more?
I really do. No. I'm available if anyone ever wants to chat about any of these issues. I really would like to dig into the science. What I really do enjoy about this type of a program is that it does, you follow up with what I think is a very theatrical presentation of a very emotional issue. And what I hope that what it will do is get you to dig in deeper. They talk about exposure to methane and what are the acute effects. Would anyone leave Gasland and figure out whether or not the effects that they had to methane are actually acute biological effects, or I can tell you the ones that they described are not. The faucet issue is a great issue. There are a lot of issues that come up in a movie like Gasland that I hope would encourage you to go read peer-reviewed studies, whether it comes from Colorado oil and natural gas conservation, whatever. Pennsylvania, Demick, it's Pavilion, Lisa Jackson's latest adventure into Pavilion. I would just encourage you to look behind the news headlines, behind the message, the theatrical message you got in Gasland, and really dig into the science behind it. And if I can ever help any of you do that, I'll stick around and give you my card, and I'll be happy to point you to some resources that I think will help you distinguish between fact and theater.
And I would just close with just saying that, I don't want to sound completely depressed about the political situation with all the money that's out there. And I think that the only thing that can really counter the money is citizen involvement. So it just really depends on how willing you are to get involved in this issue. And yeah, absolutely, as Nathan says, inform yourself. Look closely into it. Look at the studies if you can. Go to the websites. Try to get as many sources as you can. But in the end, if you don't get involved, even to the point where you just simply say to Jim Rogers at Duke Energy, look, I want to be able to buy my power from where I want to buy it instead of having to take it, from one source. I want to be able to say I prefer a renewable power source. That's important. So really getting involved in some way or another and writing, whoever it is in the North Carolina General Assembly or your congressman in Washington or whatever, that's the only way any of this is going to get changed, because as long as we let the economic interests move forward untroubled, nothing is going to change. So it really takes involvement.
Dick said what I wanted to say to conclude. But yeah, I would agree with that. But from an ethical perspective, I think the most troubling piece of it is the ongoing subsidies that I think distort the market around energy production and consumption. A smarter man than me once said, if you want to find out what a particular society values, if you want to find out where the nodes of power are in any society, follow the calories. And if you follow the calories, you find that we spend a great deal of calories extracting and guarding fossil fuels around the world. And that, to me, doesn't necessarily, as we've discussed here today, always reflect the desires of the majority of citizens.
So I'd like to thank Christian and the library staff for hosting us today, and I'd like to thank the panelists for their time.